Brief break.
And the paper is called Toleration, Respect and Cultural Defense.
Thank you very much. It's really great being able to talk with such a wonderful view, besides of course linguistics. It's really great. The paper I would like to discuss with you today is in fact a part of a larger research project concerning the scope for practices of toleration within a liberal democracy grounded in the principle of equal respect for persons. And in particular, this project revolves around a central question that you find summarized at point 1 of your handout, and there are other copies of the handouts in case someone came in later and couldn't have one. And the question concerns the way in which liberal democratic institutions can treat all members of society, including those belonging to some minority group, in a way that is consistent with the demand of the principle of equal respect for persons. And throughout the project, I've engaged with different minority claims coming from different types of minorities that range from dissenting minorities with a clear religious connotation, but also political minorities that simply find themselves in opposition with a norm voted in by some kind of majority, and so have addressed different issues and different practices of toleration that can be exercised in response to different types of minorities that include both cultural and exemption rights. I know this will be the topic of some other talks even later on in the day, and also issues of civil disobedience and conscientious objection. But the practice of toleration with which I shall engage today is a practice which belongs to the more traditional realm of multicultural studies, and it concerns the so-called practice of the cultural defense. I shall enter into a little more details about the cultural defense in a minute, but we can define very broadly the cultural defense as that legal practice by which some members of a minority group appeals in court to his or her minority convictions as a sort of an explanation from some action she carried out in good faith, but it is considered as a crime by the standard of the host community, or at any rate in the community in which the act took place. And the question I would like to address is whether the cultural defense as a practice of toleration can be ruled out in a liberal democracy qua disrespectful, qua incompatible with the basic liberal democratic commitment to treating all persons with equal respect. And that's a claim that has been discussed at various levels, both in the philosophical and the legal literature, on this kind of practice, on the assumption that the cultural defense can be justified in the name of respect for culture, and in fact it overemphasizes respect for culture to the detriment of respect for persons, for individuals, for persons as rational agents capable of taking on responsibility for their actions. The question I would like to address is whether the cultural defense can actually be ruled out qua disrespectful, and my reply would be a qualified no, meaning that we should understand better what the demands of respect actually amount to in a liberal democracy in order to give a nuanced answer to this question. And once we've done that, we will see that the cultural defense is in fact compatible with a fundamental commitment to treating the cultural offenders as rational agents capable of taking on responsibility for their actions, and even in those cases in which the cultural defense is actually disrespectful on a specific understanding of respect, which I shall qualify, in fact, it is legitimate for legal institutions to disrespect the cultural offenders under specific circumstances. In order to defend this claim, I shall proceed as follows. I'll just start by giving you working definitions of respect, toleration, and the cultural defense, and then I shall try and bring these terms together to try and see the compatibilities and incompatibilities between these different ideals. By the end of the talk, I hope I will be able to offer a defense, a respect-based defense of the room for cultural defense in a liberal democracy, democracy, although my argument is not to the effect of giving a fully fledged defense of this practice. We may have separate grounds for not wanting the cultural defense to be used in courts in liberal democracy. They may be related to the impact that the cultural defense may have on the rights of women, which are usually victims of the kind of crimes for which the cultural defense is actually invoked. Or we may even may want to build arguments in the name of the right of the majority culture to protect a certain kind of cultural norms, as one of the claims that was raised earlier this morning. What I would like to argue for is a more circumscribed claim. We cannot rule out the cultural defense quite disrespectful of individual agency. Okay? Respect, point 2 in your handout. I take the principle of equal respect for persons that is at work and that it is plausible to place at the basis of the liberal democratic order as demanding that person's moral status as a person be reckoned with while interacting with this person. This is the idea of recognition of respect. It was famously developed by the moral philosopher Stephen Darwell. And the idea is that in order to treat persons with respect, we should recognize that these persons are persons and therefore bear a distinctive dignity associated with their status that command to be taken into consideration anytime we relate and interact with those who are the bearers of this dignity. Respect is, in liberal democratic theory, is thought to be an egalitarian idea. And in order to be capable of defending respect on an egalitarian basis, we need to identify a morally relevant property, the equal possession of which by human beings qualifies them as persons on an equal basis and entitles them to the same respectful treatment as an appropriate response to the dignity associated with their moral status. Now, according to Stephen Darwell, a recognition of respect is due to persons by virtue of their power of rational choice, which qualifies persons as free agents and confers dignity upon them. A problem emerges here in terms of the cogency of this account, and this problem was introduced in the literature, as far as I know, by Bernard Williams in terms of the problems of the basis of equality. So if we understand the problem in the way the respect in the egalitarian manner I've just sketched, and we think that the ascription of equal status and equal respect depends on our capacity to identify an empirical property, the possession of which, an empirically morally relevant property, the possession of which by persons is equal, and therefore persons are entitled to equal treatment, we will be faced by a very big problem, which is the fact that people tend not to be equal in their basic properties, in their empirical properties. And the properties of rational agency, on which Darwell concentrates, is quite exemplar from this point of view. People are just different in their capacity to exercise the rational capacities. Some can do that better, some others are very much defective in their capacity for rational choice. So why should we treat people equally if in fact the property by virtue of which we should treat them in egalitarian terms is not possessed equally by them? Now, a recent solution to this problem was proposed by Ian Carter in terms of rethinking the moral property, the equal possession of which requires equal treatment, in the Rawlsian terms of a range property. That is a binary property which is either possessed or not possessed by persons. So in order to conceive of moral personality, in particular as a range property, we should simply assume that people possess a bare minimum of agential capacities over which their moral personality supervenes, and insofar as the moral personality is understood as a range property, that is a binary property that is either possessed or not, then people are bound to be considered as possessing equal personality, moral personality equally, insofar as they are above the threshold. Okay? So if we conceive of moral personality as a range property in this sense, we seem to be capable of identifying that empirical trait that justifies equal treatment for persons. The question is, why should we focus on the range property rather than on the scalar properties over which moral personality supervenes? And the response that Carter suggests is that that it is demanded by a specific type of respect that he calls opacity respect. So to treat persons with respect in this understanding means to treat them as opaque to our judgment, insofar as their position above the threshold of moral personality is concerned. So in order to treat persons with respect, we should refrain from making any judgment on where exactly a person is placed within the range characterized by the possession of this property. We should be blind to their location. This is a way in which we can recognize the dignity of persons without unduly exposing them by revealing the exact degree at which they possess the agential capacities. Now, two qualifications here before I move on. The first qualification is that although opacity respect demands in its original formulation that we refrain, that we express respect by refrain from entering in these kind of judgments, in fact, this strikes many as a sort of a utopian requirement. I mean, we tend to make judgment about persons and about their agential capacities all the time. So what opacity respect demands precisely is that we refrain from considering this judgment, which may happen to be making, as a valid reason for action. We refuse to consider the assessment of the agential capacities of others as a solid, valid, and legitimate grounds on the basis of which we should establish how people should be treated. Okay? This is the first qualification. Second qualification regards the kind of relations, interpersonal relations, in which the requirements of opacity respect apply. Again, I shall adopt here a circumscribed reading of opacity respect, considering it as mainly as a political principle. So opacity respect is the kind of attitude that we should display towards citizens, as our fellow citizens, and it's the kind of principle that should also inform vertical relations between institutions and citizens in a liberal democracy. And if you think about it, I'm not really saying anything more than restating a basic democratic principle, one head, one vote, independently of how well people will exercise the right to vote. That's the right to vote and the equal distribution of rights to vote is an area in which opacity respect seems to be a guiding ideal. We distribute equally voting rights independently of the actual agential capacities and the competence of different citizens. Otherwise, certainly in my country, many people should be not included in the constituency. So it's actually a good thing that we have this idea of respect as a basic for the distribution of voting rights. Okay. So much about respect. I was very quick, so probably if I was not very clear, I hope I will have the chance to clarify points during the discussion. I will be much briefer and hopefully clearer concerning the definition of toleration, because my definition of toleration is a very basic account of the general concept of toleration, which I take to be compatible with several different conceptions, both positive and negative. Toleration is forbearance, or the more recent account of toleration is recognition, and it is summarized at point 3 in your handout. According to this concept of toleration, A tolerates B if and only if, despite A's dislike or disapproval of a feature X of B, and A's either actual or potential power to interfere negatively with X, A refrains from interfering negatively with B's X. Okay? I take most of you to be familiar, I take this characterization to be fairly uncontroversial. So first question, are toleration so characterized and respect characterized in the terms of recognition, respect, plus the requirement of opacity, two compatible ideals? A twofold reply. For A in your handout, not only toleration and respect may be seen as compatible. In fact, toleration may be seen as grounded in recognition respect. A recognizes B as a person, and therefore, out of respect for B's moral personality, does not interfere with B's exercise of her agential capacities, even though A would be in the position to do so, and regardless of base negative judgment of the feature X of B. However, this seemingly happy ending is soon jeopardized because on the basis of my characterization of opacity respect, the characterization I gave you of opacity respect, certain practices of toleration are in fact incompatible with certain interpretation of respect, and in particular certain relations of toleration are definitely informed by the kind of negative judgments that opacity respect prevents from making. And let me give you an example, which is not necessarily relevant for the discussion of cultural defense. It's just an aside, just to illustrate the tension between toleration and opacity respect. Think about the practice of muzzling women to cover their head and shoulder. Muzzling women's agential capacities to make rational choices is often disputed in regard to their wearing a veil or something more covering than a veil, in fact. Because this practice is considered the result of a male-dominated cultural brainwashing that negatively affects their capacity to make autonomous choices. Such a judgment of muzzling women's agential capacities is part and parcel of the objection that gives rise to toleration. This must be a valid reason on the basis of which we could prevent an act in order for toleration to occur. Otherwise, we will seem indifferent to the practice if the negative judgment won't be present. The general presumption at work in such a judgment is that even if the members of the minority were in the possession of their agential capacities as the same level as the majority, they could never believe what they believe or do what they do. So from this vantage point, it appears that although toleration and respect are generally compatible, certain practices of toleration, which are dependent on the negative judgments of the agential capacities of the tolerated, are incompatible with certain interpretations of respect, in keeping with the characterization of opacity respect I tried to sketch. So, if this makes sense and you are still with me, the question I would like to raise now is whether the cultural defense is one of these practices of toleration that is to be ruled out from a liberal democracy qua incompatible with opacity respect. So in order to specify better this question, let me give you a clearer account of what the cultural defense is. Point 5 in your handout, we have a cultural defense where members of some minority group appeal in court to the cultural traditions as at least a partial excuse when charged of some offense they carried out in good faith following a cultural practice. Practices for which the cultural defense is often invoked range from honor killing to female genital mutilations, arranged marriages, polygamy, even cases of child abuse were discussed in the literature. Despite their differences, common to all such practices is their having a different meaning for the minority group who performs them than for the majority culture that standardly condemns and prohibits them. I think that the cultural defense can be considered as an interesting instance of a practice of toleration in a liberal democracy, because in these cases, despite the negative judgment of the cultural motivated offense, the offender is tolerated insofar as is not treated as an ordinary criminal, but rather at least partially excused. So I should probably specify that in most of attempts to defend the cultural defense, the cultural defense is not seen as a practice of toleration, meaning that cultural offenders should not be prosecuted or should be de-exculpated completely. The idea is to give room for their cultural reasons in courts in order to, as a kind of, to play an explanatory function of the act and perhaps work as a kind of attenuating circumstance or an excuse, rarely as a justification. So that's characterized, point 6 in your handout. Should the cultural defense be ruled out as a disrespectful practice of toleration? To treat persons with respect, as I argued, the standard entails that persons should be treated as responsible for their beliefs and actions. Opacity respect requires that such a treatment be extended to all persons equally, without making it dependent on any judgment of their actual agential capacities beyond the threshold of moral personality. However, treatment in accordance with the assessment of such capacities and of the extent to which they are burdened by the defendant's cultural commitments is exactly what occurs in legal courts when the cultural defense is adopted. So prima facie, it would seem that the cultural defense is actually incompatible with treating persons with respect. In fact, I think that this prima facie reaction is wrong because we should distinguish between two kinds of assessments of a person's agential capacities that may occur in court during a trial. The distinction is jotted down at point 7 in your handout. We may want to assess and in fact de facto reassess the defendant's agential capacity in courts, either to establish whether a person passes the threshold of moral personality and can therefore be attributed the status of moral agent in the first place, or to establish the degree to which the defendant possesses her agential capacities beyond the threshold. The first binary assessment is crucial to establishing whether the defendant can be attributed some kind of moral responsibility in the first place. Persons are by default assumed to pass the threshold unless some evidence existed to the contrary. Particularly ferocious crimes against other persons, for example, may suggest the need to look for such evidence, and therefore to establish whether a person's agential capacities are defective in such a way that places him outside the range of the property of moral personality. But the second, scalar assessment, is carried out to locate the exact position of the defendant above the threshold and the degree to which she can be held responsible for her actions, not whether she can be held responsible or not, in absolute terms. Such an inquiry is typical of cases of cultural defense. The cultural offender's agential capacities are assessed to establish the impact that her cultural belonging may have had in her capacity of assessing the demands of the legal system and in thinking about the consequences of the act. And therefore, an assessment of such capacity seems to be essential to establishing the kind of punishment to which this person should be subjected. So given this qualification, and here I move to the last point, point 8 in your handout, is the cultural defense disrespectful, and if so, in what sense? Well, I think that on the basis of the account I've just given, the demands of opacity respect are certainly violated in the case of the cultural defense, but I think it is in fact a legitimate violation. And the grounds on which I make this claim is not really sophisticated, in fact, but is grounded in the claim that the demands of opacity respect in the political and legal realm may be suspended, even temporarily, when the act of the person concerned violated some fundamental liberal rights of others. And here I'm simply stating a basic liberal principles on the basis of which the extent at which someone can exercise unprevented from others freedom of choice as necessarily to be limited on consideration of the impact such an exercise has on the fundamental liberal rights of others. Needless to say, you need a substantive account of what this list of rights should comprise in order to give a fully fledged defense of the cultural defense, but I think that just the general plausibility of the claim is enough to substantiate the argument, my argument at this stage. So, insofar as violations of the liberal rights of others are generally implicated in those cases for which the cultural defense is invoked, it seems that it is legitimate that legal institutions tear the veil of opacity apart and consider how exactly certain cultural commitments have affected the agential capacities of the defendant, as well as the extent to which they should be considered in assessing the offender's degree of responsibility. In the case of the cultural defense, in other words, the evaluation of the defendant's agential capacity is part and parcel of a practice of toleration, whereby members of a minority group, when charged with an offense, demanded their culture-specific reasons be heard and considered as a possible attenuating circumstance or an excuse for their behavior, despite the majority's negative judgment of such behavior and relatedly of the defendant's agential capacities. However, the legitimacy of the violation of the requirements of opacity respect does not imply per se that the cultural defense violates even the basic, more fundamental requirement of recognition respect for persons, because as argued, the kind of judgments implicated in the cultural defense are not aimed at establishing whether the defendant can bear responsibility at all, but exactly what kind of responsibility, what degree of responsibility the defendant can actually be considered as bearing. So the suspension of the requirement of opacity respect does not per se imply a suspension of recognition respect to poor. Persons are disrespected in this latter sense when they are wrongly placed below the threshold of moral personality. When they are considered as, when they are infantilized, one may say. The cultural defense is compatible with treating persons in accordance with the demands of recognition respect, insofar as there is no reasons to place cultural offenders below the threshold of moral personality. This entails that cultural offenders cannot be held completely responsible for their actions, and more generally, that the demands of recognition respect must be taken into consideration in the articulation of the trial. So to conclude and to summarize, my argument has suggested that the cultural defense may find room in a liberal democracy grounded in the principle of respect for persons as a tolerant practice towards cultural minority groups, or better, towards the members of cultural minority groups. The cultural defense may be considered a viable practice of toleration insofar as the demands of opacity respect are suspended in court, facing cultural offenders, provided that the offense violates the liberal rights of others on an account of liberal rights that must be provided by any substantive liberal theory. What is more, treatment that accords with an evaluation of the offender's agential capacities does not amount to a general violation of recognition respect, insofar as the offender is treated as standing above the threshold of moral personality. Thus characterized, the cultural defense can be considered one of the clearly circumscribed spheres in which toleration may be appropriately exercised in a liberal democracy that is consistent with what is due to persons in terms of equal respect for them, for persons. Thank you.